Johnny Carson had hosted thousands of guests. But none of them had ever tried what Steve Martin did that night: stop the show and ask Johnny for something. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. October 1979. Studio 6B at NBC in Burbank, California. The familiar theme music had played. Johnny had delivered his monologue, sharp, perfectly timed, the audience laughing in all the right places. Ed McMahon sat in his chair to the right, that reassuring presence he'd been for nearly 2 decades. Doc Severinsen and the orchestra waited in their positions, instruments gleaming under the warm studio lights. Everything was exactly as it should be. Exactly as it had been for thousands of shows before. Steve Martin was the guest. By 1979, he was already a phenomenon. His comedy albums were going platinum. His stand-up tours were selling out arenas. Saturday Night Live had made him a household name. He was the hottest comedian in America, and appearing on Carson was both a victory lap and a rite of passage. The audience applauded wildly as Steve walked through the famous curtain in his signature white suit, that arrow through the head prop nowhere in sight tonight. He waved, grinned that familiar grin, shook Johnny's hand, and settled into the guest chair. "Steve Martin, ladies and gentlemen," Johnny said, and the applause continued for a long moment before fading. They talked. Johnny asked about the tour. Steve told a funny story about a mishap in Cleveland. The audience laughed. Everything was smooth, professional, exactly what both men had done 100 times before. And then, 3 minutes into the interview, Steve's expression changed. The grin faded. His body language shifted. He sat forward in the chair, his hands clasped together, and he looked directly at Johnny Carson with an intensity that wasn't comedic. Wasn't performative. "Johnny," Steve said, his voice quieter than it had been moments before. "Can I ask you something? Something real?" Johnny Carson, master of the medium, reader of 10,000 guests, felt the shift immediately. His eyebrows raised slightly. He glanced at Ed McMahon, who was watching with sudden alertness. Then back to Steve. "Of course," Johnny said carefully. Steve took a breath. "I need to stop being funny for a minute. Is that okay?" The studio audience, conditioned by years of watching The Tonight Show, went quiet. This wasn't part of the usual rhythm. Guests didn't ask to stop being funny. Guests performed. They told their stories. They plugged their projects. They didn't break character. Carson stopped mid-conversation. The entire studio froze. Johnny set down his coffee mug, that small gesture he used when something required his full attention. He leaned back slightly in his chair, giving Steve space, and nodded. "Go ahead." Steve looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up at Johnny. "My father is dying." The words landed in the studio like a physical thing. The audience's collective breath caught. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet slightly. Ed McMahon's perpetual smile disappeared. Johnny didn't move. Didn't speak. Just waited with that patience he'd developed over 30 years of listening to people. "He has about 6 weeks left," Steve continued, his voice steady but carrying an edge of something raw beneath it. "Cancer. He's at home in California. Hospice care. And we never had a great relationship. He didn't understand the comedy thing. Thought I should be a businessman. Thought the entertainment industry was frivolous." Steve stopped, swallowed hard. The cameras stayed on him. In the control room, the director made no move to cut away. Everyone understood they were witnessing something that didn't happen on television. Real vulnerability from someone whose entire career was built on never being vulnerable. "I've been on the road for 2 years straight," Steve said. "Touring. Making albums. Doing movies. And I haven't been home much. I kept telling myself I'd go see him when the tour ended. When the album was done. When things slowed down." Johnny's expression hadn't changed, but his eyes had that quality they got when he was truly listening, not hosting, not performing, just being present with another human being. "But things don't slow down," Steve said, and now his voice cracked just slightly. They just keep going. And now he's got 6 weeks and I don't know how to talk to him. I don't know how to tell him that I needed him to be proud of me. That I spent my whole life trying to make people laugh because I could never make him smile. The studio was silent. Not the silence of waiting for a punchline. The silence of 300 people holding their breath because they were watching someone break open in real time. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Johnny Carson did something then that he almost never did. He reached across his desk and picked up one of his cue cards. Not to read from it. Just to hold it. His fingers tapped against it once, twice. A small tell that the people who worked with him knew meant he was thinking carefully about what to say next. "Steve," Johnny said quietly, "why are you telling me this?" Steve looked at him with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "Because you lost your son." The studio went from silent to utterly still. This was not public knowledge. This was not something Johnny Carson talked about. Ever. In 1991, Johnny's son Rick had died in a car accident. He was 39 years old. Johnny had taken exactly 2 shows off, 2 shows in 30 years, and then come back and never mentioned it on air. Not once. It was the most guarded pain of his life. But this was 1979. Rick Carson was still alive. Still estranged from his father. Still navigating that complicated relationship that fathers and sons often have when the father is famous, and the son is trying to find his own way. "I don't." Johnny started, then stopped. He set the cue card down. His hand went to his tie, adjusting it, another tell, another moment of genuine uncertainty. "Steve, I don't know what you want me to tell you. I want you to tell me how to do it," Steve said, and there was desperation in his voice now, real and raw. How to talk to him. How to say the things that need to be said before it's too late. "Because you're the only person I know who seems to understand what it means to perform for the world and still have this private life that doesn't work the way it's supposed to." Johnny Carson, the king of late-night television, the man who had interviewed presidents and movie stars and musicians, sat at his desk and looked at Steve Martin with an expression that was completely unguarded. For just a moment, the cameras caught something that audiences almost never saw. Johnny without the armor. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny stood up. The action was so unexpected that Ed McMahon actually sat forward, as if preparing to intervene. The audience murmured. Steve looked startled. Johnny walked around his desk. Not toward the audience. Not toward the cameras. Toward Steve Martin, sitting in that guest chair looking suddenly young and scared despite the white suit and the fame and the sold-out arenas. Johnny pulled the other guest chair, the one they used when there were 2 guests, and positioned it directly across from Steve. He sat down, knee to knee with one of the biggest comedians in the world, and the cameras had to scramble to adjust their angles. The studio director was probably having a heart attack in the booth. This wasn't how the show worked. Johnny didn't leave his desk. He didn't sit with guests like this. He was the host. The desk was the boundary. The desk was the show. But Johnny was ignoring all of that. "Steve," Johnny said, his voice low enough that the boom mics had to strain to catch it. "I can't tell you how to fix your relationship with your father. I don't know how to do that because I haven't figured it out with my own son." Steve nodded, not speaking, just listening. "But I can tell you what I wish someone had told me," Johnny continued. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen. An expensive fountain pen, the kind he used to sign contracts and autographs. He held it up. "My father gave me this pen when I got my first hosting job. Local radio in Nebraska. I was 23 years old and terrified. He gave me this and said, 'Write your own material. Don't let anyone tell your stories for you.'" Johnny looked at the pen for a moment, turning it over in his fingers. "I carry this every day. I've had it for 30 years. And I never once told him what it meant to me." I never told him that I kept it because it was the only time he told me he believed I could do this. He looked back at Steve. You have 6 weeks. That's more than a lot of people get. Don't waste it trying to make him understand your career. Don't waste it trying to get his approval. Just sit with him. Tell him you love him. Tell him you wish things had been different. And give him the chance to say whatever he needs to say back. Johnny held out the pen. Take this. Steve stared at it. Johnny, I can't. Yes, you can, Johnny said firmly. Take it to your father. Show it to him. Tell him Johnny Carson gave it to you and said that fathers and sons don't always know how to talk to each other, but objects can carry the things we can't say out loud. Give him something to hold on to. Something that says you showed up. Steve took the pen with trembling hands. He looked at it, then at Johnny, then back at the pen. Tears were streaming down his face now, and he made no effort to hide them. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Johnny Carson did something he'd never done in 30 years of hosting The Tonight Show. He reached over and hugged Steve Martin. Not a quick celebrity hug. Not a pat on the back. A real embrace. Two men, sitting knee to knee in front of 300 people and cameras broadcasting to 23 million viewers, holding on to each other because sometimes that's all you can do. The audience didn't applaud. Not yet. They understood, on some instinctive level, that applause would cheapen this. This wasn't performance. This was life happening in the middle of television. When they separated, Johnny stood up and walked back to his desk. He didn't sit down immediately. He stood behind his chair, one hand on the back, composing himself. Ed McMahon was wiping his eyes. Doc Severinsen had his head bowed. We'll be right back, Johnny said to the camera, his voice rough, and signaled for commercial. The red light on the cameras went off. The audience sat in stunned silence. Steve Martin sat in the guest chair holding Johnny Carson's father's pen, crying openly, while stage managers rushed around trying to figure out what had just happened to the carefully planned show. During the commercial break, Johnny walked over to Steve again. Away from the cameras this time. He said something the microphones didn't catch, something that was just between them. Steve nodded. Johnny gripped his shoulder once, then walked back to his desk. When they came back from commercial, Johnny had reset his face into that professional mask. But Steve was still visibly shaken, still holding the pen. Steve Martin, ladies and gentlemen, Johnny said, and this time the audience did applaud. Not the usual enthusiastic applause. Something gentler. Something that acknowledged they'd witnessed something rare. They finished the interview talking about lighter things, upcoming projects, a funny story about the SNL cast. But Steve never let go of the pen. He held it in his lap, his fingers wrapped around it like a lifeline. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Steve Martin went to see his father the next day. He sat beside his bed and showed him Johnny Carson's pen. He told him the story. And his father, who had never understood the comedy career, who had never seen the appeal of making people laugh for a living, said something Steve had waited his entire life to hear. Johnny Carson gave you that? The Johnny Carson? Yes, Dad. His father smiled, a real smile, probably the first genuine smile Steve had seen in years. Well, if Johnny Carson thinks you're worth something, then maybe I've been wrong all these years. They talked for 3 hours that day. And for 3 hours every day for the next 6 weeks until his father died. They didn't solve everything. But they said the things that needed to be said. Steve Martin still has that pen. He's never used it. It sits in a glass case in his home office. Below it, a small plaque reads, From Johnny's father to mine. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Years later, when Johnny Carson retired, Steve was asked what moment defined Johnny's legacy. He held up a photograph, the two of them sitting knee to knee that night in 1979. This, Steve said, this is who he really was. Not the jokes. Not the monologues. This,